Welcome to This Explainer. I am so thrilled you're here, because today we're diving into something truly fascinating. We're looking at how human ingenuity basically bent rigid reality completely to its will. We're going to explore the art of the stretch, starting with a pretty brilliant historical mystery.
So, what do a first-century Roman vase and a 1920s bouncing cartoon mouse actually have in common? I mean, at first glance, ancient Syrian glassworks and vintage black and white cartoons seem, well, worlds apart, right? They exist in entirely different millennia and rely on totally different tools. But their secret connection lies in the revolutionary concept of flexibility and how abandoning stiff rules completely redefined both of their worlds. You see, before these massive breakthroughs, both of these mediums were totally boxed in by rigid structures. On one hand, you had raw, solid glass materials that were painstakingly cast or core-formed. On the other, you had static, stiff newspaper comic strips trapped by ink and rigid panels. But both mediums completely transformed their industries by ditching those stiff structures in favor of fluid curves, inflation, and boundless motion. They essentially learned how to breathe life into the inflexible.
All right, let's just dive right in. We'll track this overarching arc of fluidity through a few key chapters. First, shaping the inflexible, then glassblowing, breath and fire, followed by rubber hose, ink and bounce. After that, we'll look at the shift toward realism and wrap up with a lasting fluid legacy. We're going to see exactly how innovation truly stretches our world.
Okay, Chapter 1. Glassblowing, breath and fire.
So this technique pops up right in the middle of the 1st century BC, thanks to some incredibly clever Phoenician and Syrian craftsmen. They tapped into this previously unknown working property of glass called inflation, and it all revolves around the parason, which is basically just a bubble of molten glass formed by blowing a tiny bit of air through a blowpipe. By giving short puffs of air into this molten blob, early glassworkers could suddenly shape liquid glass. This actually works because the atoms in glass form a disordered, random network, making it just viscous enough to be blown and stretched before it eventually hardens as it loses heat.
But to get there, the crucial element is just sheer, mind-boggling heat. We are talking 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the staggering temperature it literally takes to transform raw materials into workable glass. It emits enough heat to glow almost white-hot. Then it's left to fine out, allowing the bubbles to rise out of the mass, before being slightly cooled down to about 2,000 degrees, where it takes on this incredibly bright orange color.
Now, working with that kind of searing heat takes a wildly delicate, rapid-fire choreography. The glassblower is executing a perfectly timed sequence here. You gather the molten glass on a blowpipe, roll it on a steel or marble marver to shape a cool outer skin, and then, puff, you blow air to create the bubble. The piece is then transferred to a punty rod for final shaping, and finally, and honestly this is make or break, it's placed in an annular to slowly cool. If it cools too fast, the thermal stress will literally cause the whole thing to shatter.
This newfound crazy flexibility gave birth to two groundbreaking methods. First, you've got free blowing, which relies entirely on the worker's mid-air skill to inflate and shape the glass on the fly. And then, shortly after, mold blowing hits the scene. This is where the glass glob is inflated directly into a carved wooden or metal mold. This was an absolute game changer because it allowed for the speedy mass production of highly textured, complex designs, which meant beautifully detailed glass could spread all across the ancient world.
And it didn't just change art, you guys, it redrew the map of manufacturing. Invented in the 1st century BC by those Phoenician and Syrian craftsmen, the technique spread like wildfire into the heart of the Roman Empire. As Rome grew, so did the dominance of blown glass, totally replacing older, stiffer casting methods. It survived the fall of the empire, eventually evolving into the renowned, super-refined Murano Cristallo of the Middle Ages in Italy, and that momentum carried all the way through to the modern studio glass movement starting in 1962.
All right, let's switch gears to our second major leap in human creativity: rubber hose, ink, and bounce.
So now we are making a hard pivot to early 1920s New York City. We've got a totally different group of artists trying to mold rigid, static comic ink into fluid motion. Animation was a brand new phenomenon, and studios were just scrambling to keep up with intense audience demand.
Faced with a serious lack of experienced animators, artists like Bill Nolan invented a clever shortcut known as rubber hose limbs, meaning animating arms and legs as flowing curves without any articulated joints like hinged knees or elbows. By ditching those pesky joints and making characters rounder, the whole drafting process became significantly faster. Characters could stretch over absurd distances, their limbs could be tied up in literal knots, and they moved with this flowing, curving motion like an actual rubber hose. It created a highly surreal visual quality that absolutely captivated early audiences, and it was massively popularized by icons like Felix the Cat, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and yeah, of course, Mickey Mouse.
And here's where this fluidity completely changed the game. As reviewers at the time pointed out, the rubber hose-styled film found popularity with the use of its sound. Because the animation was just so incredibly flexible and fluid frame by frame, it was the perfect match for the introduction of audio. Studios like Fleischer created song cartoons, syncing bouncing visual elements, like that famous bouncing ball, perfectly with musical beats. Disney pushed this even further with their silly symphonies, making music the absolute focal point of all that fluid bouncing animation.
For over a decade, this bouncy style totally dominated. From its 1920s comic strip origins in New York, through the wildly popular synchronized sound era of the late 20s and early 30s, the rubber hose style was the absolute standard of American animation. But 1937 brought a massive disruption with the release of Snow White, ushering in a brand new era of anatomical realism.
Which brings us right to part 3, the shift toward realism. Because both of these highly flexible, stylized art forms eventually had to adapt to changing industrial, technological, and artistic demands.
It's actually wild how beautifully these two distinct histories mirror each other, because just as that surreal, boundless rubber hose style in animation was replaced by anatomical realism and natural movement, traditional, free-flowing hand-blown glass had to share space with ultra-precise, rigid machinery used in modern high-tech manufacturing. The demand for exact precision really started to overshadow the raw, free-form art of the stretch. Over in Hollywood, audiences were suddenly craving realism. Walt Disney's massive success with full-length features proved that viewers wanted lifelike anatomy and natural movement. Throw in advanced film tech like Technicolor, and this trend forced even the longest holdouts like Fleischer Studios in New York to finally conform. By 1940, they had practically abandoned their signature rubbery, jointless limbs. And similarly, over in the glass world, while the stunning artistry of hand glass blowing definitely stuck around, its raw physical utility as a production method totally shifted. The unique properties of glass were now needed in high-tech, modern spaces. We're talking semiconductor manufacturing, analytical science instruments, life science tools, and strict medical applications. These fields don't exactly want free-flowing bubbles. They require machinery to shape and form glass with absolute, rigid accuracy and extreme precision. But as we move into our fourth and final section, a lasting fluid legacy, we find out that you really can't keep a great idea down forever. Despite being temporarily overshadowed by anatomical realism and high-tech machinery, the underlying brilliance of these fluid techniques refused to stay buried.
The really cool takeaway here is that human appreciation for this kind of boundless creativity always seems to return. Both of these art forms have experienced massive modern revivals. Back in 1962, the studio glass movement, kicked off by a ceramics professor and a chemist, brought small furnaces directly back to individual artists' studios, sparking a worldwide explosion of flamboyant, modern blown glass art. And on the animation side, the surreal magic of the 1920s rubber hose aesthetic was spectacularly resurrected for a totally new generation by hit video games like Cuphead and its animated series adaptation.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating final thought to chew on. If human ingenuity can figure out how to make solid, burning glass literally breathe and static newspaper ink bounce off the page, what rigid rules of today are just waiting to be stretched tomorrow? The next time you see a neon sign, a beautiful vase, or a classic cartoon, remember the innovators who looked at something stiff and inflexible and decided to just bend it to their will. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.